Get started. So good evening. I hope everybody is safe and well. I'm Paula Gutlove. I'm a member of the Mass Peace Action Climate Working Group, and I want to welcome everyone, and I want to thank you for coming and being a part of this conversation. We're thrilled that so many people signed up for this conversation, and we welcome you to join us in our work with the Mass Peace Action Peace and Climate Working Group. I want to start by honoring how hard, how stressful, how difficult this time is. It's a confusing time. And yet, in stressful times, there can be a new clarity of thinking. We can discern sometimes with new clarity what's true, what's important. We can find new power. We can empower each other. We can raise our voices together. So this is also a time of opportunity. This evening, we're going to look at the interrelationships between war, militarism, human needs, and climate security. We're going to ask each of us to think about what we can do individually, what we can do together to transform an outdated security paradigm, outdated budget priorities, from military spending to truly meeting human needs. And we're going to think about what the role of the Green New Deal is in this transformation. Despite the darkness of this moment, we have unprecedented opportunities to transform what has been politically impossible in the past to politically inevitable in the future. Our goal this evening is to think about how we are going to work together to create and to implement a politically inevitable program that takes us into and through the election in November. We're going to start the evening by showing a 10-minute video. After the video, we're going to have 3 speakers to provide additional information and context. Then we're going to have an opportunity to speak to each other in smaller groups, and then come back to the whole for a final discussion and to plan our next steps together. The video we are about to watch discusses the true costs of the military-industrial complex, particularly the impact of militarism on the climate crisis and on the environment. It points out the interrelationships between war, militarism, human needs, and climate security. And I'm going to share my screen now and roll the film.
It's time to talk about the elephant in the room, the single most polluting U.S. military, because the U.S. war machine currently has a yearly budget of over $700 billion, which dwarfs the military spending of the next 8 countries combined in 2018. The U.S. military is a behemoth, and the environmental consequences of its massive size and global presence are equally immense. Indeed, if the American military was a country, it would rank 47th, right in between Peru and Portugal for the highest global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's only based on military fuel use. Despite this, we're rarely exposed to the idea of the US military-industrial complex as a possible contributor to climate change. Instead, individual actions like taking shorter showers or composting food waste seem to be the primary push of the environmental movement. So the big question is, what are the consequences of this massive US military machine? And ultimately, what are the connections between militarism and climate change? The environmental cost of the US military is so large because the country has continuously piled money into the Department of Defense ever since the 1980s Reagan-era push for military spending transformed the world's biggest lender into the biggest debtor. A recently approved defense budget of $738 billion for the 2020 fiscal year only cements this lust for U.S. military growth around the globe. And to be clear, the US military is a global entity. It has established roughly 800 military bases in 80 countries around the world, according to David Vine, author of Base Nation. To put that in perspective, all other countries combined have established roughly 70 foreign bases. So the US military is gargantuan. And to fuel that machine, they need, well, fuel. From 2001 to 2017, the US military emitted an estimated 1.2 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent, according to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. That's the same as putting an additional 257 million cars, or roughly the amount of passenger cars currently in operation, on the road in the US for a whole year. From Humvees running at 4 miles per gallon or gas-guzzling F-22 fighter jets, the machines of war that the Department of Defense purchases and maintains require a lot of fuel, in the realm of 85 million barrels of fuel in 2017. But the US military pollution does not stop and end at emissions. The military has blazed a sharp trail of environmental and chemical pollution across the world, racking up 39,000 contaminated sites, according to a Newsweek interview with the former head of environmental programs at the Pentagon. 143 of the Superfund sites in the United States are military bases, and 900 of the 1,344 total sites are areas that previously supported military needs, according to the same Newsweek interview. At Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, for example, the drinking water servicing 170,000 people is so polluted with cancer-causing chemical solvents like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene that it's been called
the worst example of water contamination this country has ever seen.
In short, the US military has a long track record of pollution and emissions that often is tacitly accepted by otherwise environmentally minded people in the name of national defense and military preparedness. But let's be clear here. The majority of the wars the US has fought and the massive military structure it's built has rarely been in the name of peace or safety. More often than not, it's centered around profit and control. The United States has a long history of using military power to assert dominance over potentially strategic or profitable entities. Like in Panama in 1989, when George H.W. Bush deployed 25,000 troops to oust the military leader and previous CIA asset, General Noriega, who began acting against U.S. interests. In Noriega's stead, Bush propped up Guillermo Endara, who was much more loyal to the U.S. global agenda, or in 1973, when the United States supported a coup to overthrow democratically elected Chilean socialist leader Salvador Allende, replacing him with ruthless dictator Augusto Pinochet, who in the months following his rise to power imprisoned, tortured, and killed thousands of supposed leftist sympathizers in order to establish an economy that a New York Times reporter called, quote-unquote, a banker's delight, or the US-backed indiscriminate slaughter of East Timorese by Indonesian forces, or the multi-decade war razing Iraq to the ground to protect the flow of fuel from Middle Eastern oil fields into American cars. The same oil fields which Vice President Dick Cheney's former company, Halliburton, secured a non-competitive contract for up to $7 billion to rebuild. The list drags on. The point here is this. In many cases, the US military has guzzled millions of barrels of fuel and killed thousands to establish and maintain control of profitable international interests. One of the most decorated Marines in US history, Major General Smedley Butler, rams this reality home in his book, War is a Racket.
I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism.
Ironically, the Department of Defense has released reports characterizing climate change as a security risk. But of course, their solution is not to scale back their own emission-intensive operations, but instead, it's doing more of the same. So when we're trying to understand the connections between environmentalism and demilitarization, we have to recognize a simple reality. War is always an environmental hazard. There is no such thing as a responsible military or green war. It is, in fact, irresponsible to suggest that it's possible to green the military, as Elizabeth Warren has proposed. Though it is admirable to find solutions within a corrupt and irredeemable system, the 2018 IPCC report has made clear that we have no time for slow change, and small reforms prevent us from focusing and investing in the larger, more radical changes that need to happen. Demilitarization is a lofty goal. In the United States, it is not unreasonable to feel despair about the possibility of ever demilitarizing a country with such a fetish for violence and control. But dire circumstances require radical solutions. Keep in mind that even if the current military budget is slashed in half, the US would still spend more than double the amount China does. So the military-industrial complex is beyond bloated. And as we look towards a future marked by climate change, to me it's clear where taxpayer money needs to go. If the United States can pour $4.79 trillion into the wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, they certainly can extract themselves from a fossil fuel-centric economy. The money doesn't need to be piled into the over-polluting and violent machine that is the US military. It instead needs to be invested in strong, publicly favored initiatives like the Green New Deal, which would supply dignified low-carbon jobs to thousands, reinvest in the US's crumbling infrastructure, and establish an economy based on care. The gift-giving season is upon us, and usually that means a lot of material-centric presents that either get left in the closet
Okay, so we will put the URL for the movie in the chat box, but right now we're going to have a couple of speakers. We're going to speak to the movie and beyond. Our speakers this evening are Paul Shannon, Gordon Thompson, and Rosalie Anders. All three are members of Mass Peace Action's Peace and Climate Working Group. So we're going to start with Paul.
Well, thank you, Paula. So I think the film does a terrific job at pointing out some of those connections between war, militarism, and climate change, and by implication, of course, the need for the climate movement to also become an anti-war movement, if there is any chance of succeeding. Great information about how much fossil fuel emissions the Pentagon puts into the atmosphere. The Pentagon contributes 5% of world emissions. What that means, of course, is that whatever emissions our efforts have kept out of the, whatever emissions we have kept out of the atmosphere, the Pentagon puts it right back in. Secondly, it's got a great section on the vast resources consumed by the Pentagon, the very resources that are absolutely essential to any serious attempt to ward off climate catastrophe. Not just talking about financial resources, we're talking about intellectual, human resources that are presently going into constructing nuclear weapons, all kinds of new military technologies. Let me give you an example. It is estimated that the Green New Deal, which people will be speaking to later, would cost about the federal spending of about $3 trillion over 30 years. Now that is absolute chump change in comparison to the $24 trillion that will be spent by the Pentagon over that same period of time. Now there are even more important connections than these two between war and climate. The first, of course, is that like the coronavirus that we face right now, this emergency cannot be addressed without international cooperation. Without the cooperation of China, Russia, and other major climate-destroying countries, it will be impossible to prevent the most destructive results of climate change. Nothing undermines international cooperation like arms races, wars, and threats of war, the very things that increase the profits and stock values of Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing, and others. Even more important, the historical record makes it clear that the primary purpose of our wars is not to protect us. We'll go to Smedley Butler in the film to express that opinion very clearly. In fact, it is protecting a fossil fuel-centric economy that is the very thing that we are trying to change. Our goals and the goals of our military are diametrically opposed. Now, the present emergency shows that we are capable of taking drastic action, never before imagined even, when confronted by a crisis that could wreak havoc on human life on Earth. The extreme measures being taken to fight the pandemic, including destroying millions of jobs and much of the economy, shows what we are willing to do when we perceive that we are faced with a crisis of this size. And is leading to a reevaluation by many people of what defending our country means. Did $738 billion from the military budget that they just passed protect us in the least from the onslaught of the coronavirus? Did building a massive wall on the Mexican border keep us safe? And yet, outside of a nuclear attack, could any adversary have more thoroughly brought our economy to its knees or so threatened our way of life? The measures needed to address climate change are not nearly as draconian or painful as those needed to address the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, they will promote community, mutual aid, and our well-being. But they must be taken with the same urgency, and they must be taken now. There is an opening now to create a new narrative about what national security and national welfare really are. Rosalie and Gordon will now give us some ideas about that narrative and about how to make the Green New Deal part of that narrative that we must develop. Gordon?
Thank you, Paul. I'm Gordon Thompson. Paul has done an excellent job of showing us why we need a new national security narrative. And I'd like to briefly discuss the translation of that into national security budgeting. We do need to invest our money in different things. And one of those things is a thing of great importance is the Green New Deal, which Rosalie Anders will be discussing in a minute. I'd like to offer an idea as a bridge between military budgeting and the Green New Deal, and that's the idea of creating an integrated national security budget to reconfigure our national security budgeting process so that we spend money on real security. I believe that MAPA, Mass Peace Action, ourselves, could play a leading role in this, and it would dovetail very nicely with national efforts to promote a Green New Deal. So I invite your consideration of a campaign leading to legislation ultimately for integrated national security budgeting. Now I'd like to pass to Rosalie Anders. Thank you, Rosalie.
Thanks, Gordon. I was going to talk briefly about the Green New Deal, which was created by the Sunrise Movement, youth-led, and introduced in Congress by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and our own Ed Markey. It is the first effort to really look at the climate crisis at the scale that it requires. And very important, it links the issues that surround climate destruction, militarism, and injustice. It's pretty brief. If you haven't read it, I suggest you Google the legislation because so many misleading things are said about it. At its heart, After laying out the scope of the climate crisis, it calls for the U.S. to use our technological capacity for the economic transformation we need. It has three key components: millions of good jobs, prosperity and economic security, combating economic injustice, and it says that these must all be part of this New Deal. It goes on to list a number of areas we need to tackle: creating 100% renewable electricity, transforming our transportation system, land restoration, sustainable agriculture, revamping our buildings, clean manufacturing. So how do we do this? Well, to make all this happen, the Green New Deal calls for developing policies and programs collaboratively, including frontline communities, labor, civil society groups, businesses, academia. It calls for ensuring the public has a return on investment, that it provides and leverages adequate capital to communities, government agencies, and businesses working on it. It calls for guaranteeing good jobs and benefits for everyone. It spells out ensuring workers' rights, protecting Indigenous peoples' rights, protecting U.S. businesses from unfair competition. And it calls for healthcare for all, housing for all, and equitable education. Now, while it recognizes that climate disruption is a national security threat, it does not spell out a shift in our military policy. But there is room for that as we go along. Certainly, if we can get the Green New Deal passed, it would have to be part of the planning. The Green New Deal has emphasized areas where they see a national consensus is possible, and I think that's one reason it says less about the military than we might want. But I believe it is our greatest hope for peace. It would undermine the military-industrial complex. People wouldn't need to look to the military for jobs. Oil would not be a driver of military intervention, and international cooperation would be a priority. The specifics of how the Green New Deal will happen aren't in the legislation. And this is important because figuring out how to do any of this is a big job. We know quite a bit about all these areas, but crafting legislation takes time and expertise. And this is about resetting national priorities and setting the goals so the processes can start. It addresses many of the fears people have that the climate situation is hopeless. And it addresses fears of a lot of people that climate action means their livelihoods will be taken away. Mm-hmm. Now, I recently took the 4-hour Sunrise Movement course on the Green New Deal, and I thought it was terrific. I highly recommend it. They repeat it regularly, and I encourage everyone to take it. Some elements of the Green New Deal may come into play faster. For example, healthcare and housing. I think healthcare is definitely going to be at the fore right now. And the Sunrise people call these appetizers. But the overall story is the key. We need millions of people to be enthusiastic about the Green New Deal, understanding that it won't cover everything right away. We need to jump in. As peace activists, we should continue moral protests, but also talk about a different positive approach to national security, maybe something along the lines of what Gordon's talking about. Most Americans are not happy with our warmongering, and they may now be receptive if we start putting up positive 21st century alternatives. Now, nothing will happen if the Democrats don't win, so we'll need to work hard to make that happen and to work just as hard to mobilize them and the nation around this New Deal. So again, from Sunrise, they say activists assume that because something is true, it will be meaningful to people. But in fact, it's often the other way around. If something is meaningful, people will believe it's true. So now back to you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. And thank you, Paul and Gordon. Now it's up to us. The movie said dire circumstances call for radical solutions. So how are we going to come up with radical solutions together? We're going to break you up into small groups soon so that you can have a conversation about this. We're talking about 15 minutes in small groups. And my suggestion is that you introduce yourselves to start out with and check in with each other to see how everyone is doing. And once you've done that, we want you to ask yourself some questions. And I'm going to post these in the, welcome back. I hope you had a great session, a great small group. Now I'm going to give you a minute to think about what you just heard and what you just discussed in your small group. And I want you to think about what you found particularly interesting, particularly compelling. What are your priorities? How might you translate these priorities into a peace and climate action agenda? What are you most interested in doing, including but not limited to joining our Peace and Climate Action Working Group? So during this minute, while you're thinking, you could post your thoughts in the chat box. And after a minute is done, we're going to open the floor for discussion. 60 seconds to think. My gift to you.
So just post it in the chat?
Post it in the chat. If you've got some compelling thoughts,
Okay.
post them in the chat. We want to see them, and then we'll hear them later. Thank you, Michael. Okay, that was a minute. So now we'd like to open the floor for comments and discussion. And my request to you is that you raise your hand and I can recognize you. And if you want to figure out how to raise your hand, you have to press the participants tab at the bottom of your screen, and then you'll see a list of participants. And if you press the blue raise hand symbol, you'll see a raised hand next to your name. So would love to hear comments, thoughts, what's exciting, what did you hear, what do you want to share with the group? Stephen Slaner, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Stephen.
How's that?
That's great.
Well, as I said in my chat, it's extremely prosaic and boring and inadequate, and my very radical friends would be extremely annoyed with me. But I think it's really important to elect Democrats. Not that they'll do very much, but that our agenda requires at least requires that as a necessary condition, if not a sufficient one. I mean, it's very boring, but it's by no means a given that Trump will be defeated. I'm still rather pessimistic at this point. So
thank you, Stephen. We absolutely have to elect Democrats, and as Paul said, we have to hold them to a high bar. Not only elect them, but hold them to a high bar. And take your hand down once you've been called on. Maria Termini, please.
Hi.
Hi, Maria.
Hi. I hope that Nancy Abrams will also put up her hand, because I don't want to paraphrase the good words that she said. But right near the end of our meeting, it just became really clear to me that artists, poets, and musicians, yes, and I'm an artist and a poet and musicians, that I believe firmly that our creative talent is needed now more than ever before, and that we can work together to create a compelling vision of what positive change and harmony looks like. So I'm ready to sing. I play guitar, and I just also shared a song, These Are the Words by Patti Smith, which I hope people will check out. But Nancy also has some very good ideas, so I hope she will raise her hand. Thank
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. And Maria, could you put those thoughts in the chat box if you haven't already done so? Because this is where we're collecting them. Okay?
I did.
Wonderful.
I did.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Nancy, do you want to talk to us?
Well, what I was saying in the smaller group is that one of the things I hope that people get from this terrible experience with the pandemic is that you cannot fight science. You cannot fight it with ideology or religion or anything. And this pandemic is really only due to one cause, and that cause is that leaders thought they could overrule science by silencing it, because this thing probably could have been stopped in Wuhan if the scientists who first discovered it had not been silenced, because people were afraid of embarrassing Xi. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have now died because all around the world, in most countries, the leaders have said, well, what I'm interested in is more important than the science. So one of the things I think we really need is a kind of a coherent picture of reality where the Green New Deal is part of it, but not all of it. There has to be some kind of a larger view of what we are as human beings, not just as individuals, but as a force on this planet and how we fit in. There has to be that larger view that justifies everything it's going to take for the Green New Deal. That's on a kind of a spiritual, not religious, but on a kind of a spiritual level, there has to be a goal that humanity shares. And science to me seems like the best basis for it, because it's totally international, as the pandemic has shown us. I mean, seriously, I can go off on this for a long time, but all I want to say is that we are, as has been already pointed out, at an absolute pivotal moment for our whole species, and decisions that are made this year could really change the world for centuries to come. So it really matters that we not try to do something small, but that we try to put together a picture of reality that we can share, that's based on science, but is bigger than just the pandemic or just the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Nancy. And I would like to follow up with you. I will follow up with you and think about how we can create that vision. And anyone else who wants to follow up with us on that vision, please let us know in the chat box. Thank you. Someone else.
I can't see the raise hand icon on my screen. I'm sorry. Where's that?
Go ahead,
located?
Michael. Just speak.
Okay. In our group, basically we're all on the same page about being against militarism and reducing the defense budget. But I've been doing some research recently for a op-ed, opinion piece, article, whatever that I want to write, and I'll say this as concisely as I can. There's a psychological aspect here. Right now, we're witnessing death on a mass scale. And the worldwide COVID-19 fatalities are comparable to a single W-76 nuclear weapon being detonated over Boston. So it's a very opportune time, I think, to call for slashing the nuclear weapons budget, which is currently $50 billion. And the budget of the CDC is $6 billion. The cost of compare that to the cost of the new Columbia ballistic missile submarines. Those are $4 billion. The missiles for those, the Trident D5s, are $1 billion each. Nuclear weapons are useless and serve primarily to enrich private interests, and that's something that we really have to make clear to people. And I think now, when they're seeing how little our military defense has protected us from this pandemic, I think it's a time when people would be more receptive to that. So, like Stephen said about electing Democrats, I don't think we'll be able to get rid of nuclear weapons now, but I think we could definitely make the case for bringing it down to what's called the minimum deterrent level. Just getting rid of the submarines, getting rid of the bombers, and having maybe 100 ICBMs out in the middle of the country, which is not great, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we have now.
Thank you, Michael. I see a number of hands. Before you leave, Michael, I want you to post something on the chat box. And I'm thinking that maybe this falls into the integrated military strategy or integrated national security strategy that Gordon was thinking about. So put it into the box and we'll try to figure out how we can make this operational. I want to tell you what the hands I see next is Jared Richardson, then John McDonald, then Gerald Ross, and then Robert Connor. And I'm going to ask you to each be no more than a minute and a half, and I'll start pulling my ear when you're at a minute and a half. So first we have Jared. Jared, go ahead.
All right, so one thing that I've been really concerned about, because my group was talking a little bit about just the issue of the fact that we spend all this money and yet how what does it cost? This is like people talk about the Green New Deal. I just find that so ironic. They say it's going to cost $3 trillion, and then it's like, oh my God, why is it such? Why? That's insane. We could never do that. Guess what? Same 13-year period. Guess how much we'd be using roughly, or more? Guess how much money we'd be using for the military budget? 26 trillion, which aside from like necessary stuff like paying all the service members, which by the way, we don't need that many. Well, and least of all, so many aircraft carriers. We also, one thing am really worried about is just the fact that the narrative has been switched so much to America's defending the heartland, and America and the military is always right. And you see that in movies, and you see that in the news. Everyone.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you.
Okay.
We got it. Thank you. John McDonald.
McDougall.
McDougall. Sorry.
That's all right. I've been called many worse names in my life. Gordon, thank you for very briefly talking about an alternative global security system. But, you know, unfortunately, I guess there wasn't time for you to flesh it out. But I think that's something that can be mentioned much more explicitly. For example, the nuclear deal with Iran, Joint Comprehensive Plan of approach, you know, was really broad, involved very tough negotiations, but it worked in that there was a positive outcome. Obviously, Trump has wrecked it. But anyway, so diplomacy, there's a really good resource from World Beyond War, and how much people know about that. And they have come up, they have stuff on their website on a continual basis, but they have, at least in book form, something came out about 1.5 years ago, which is to me very, very accessible and covers a lot of things. Last but not least, that mentions that women often have played key roles in not only actual diplomacy and including informal kinds of diplomacy, obviously, but key roles in the kind of things that are alluded to in the video with climate, with social justice. So I think details of what an alternative security system would look like is something we can bring up, not least with candidates in the elections. Thanks.
Absolutely. And all of you with ideas about the military budget and redefining security, put your name in the chat and we'll try to coordinate something with Gordon. Thank you. I think Gerald Ross, you're next, and I'm going to ask you to cut it to 45 seconds because we're running out of time.
Okay, so a lot of very good points have been made. The perspective I've come to is that none of these things are going to be possible if Donald Trump is reelected. And all of them are going to, all of the things we worry about are going to be more likely to happen with Donald Trump being reelected. So that his defeat is the absolute priority, and everything else that we want to do, I think, has to be slightly secondary. I've recently been reading some work on by Toby Ord on existential threats, and he talks about correlating factors that make existential threats more likely to occur. And Donald Trump is the most dangerous correlating factor we have right now in terms of nuclear war, climate change, great power conflict. So that's the priority. That's where we have to focus our energies.
Thank you, Gerald. And I just want to say that it's a lot more meaningful to be for something than to be against something. So we're absolutely with you on let's get rid of Donald Trump, and let's be for something that inspires us, that makes us want to sing and dance and join together and create something worth being the ancestors that we want to be. Anyway, Jonathan King.
Oh, thank you, Paula.
And you have the last word, Jonathan, so
well,
here you get it.
Our group had a kind of...
I think you forgot Bob Connor, Paula.
Bob Connor.
Bob, sorry. Okay.
Right.
Bob, do you mind going after Jonathan?
Fine.
Okay.
Right. Our group had a kind of a two-stage view. Given millions of people who are incredibly stressed by the coronavirus outbreak and the fear of getting sick and the fear of dying, three of us thought that the leading edge of the positive call is something like healthcare for all, Medicare for all. But the economy is getting devastated. It's going to be a new world. When the coronavirus passes, we're going to need to rebuild. That is the time for the Green New Deal, right? To say to people, oh, don't worry about coronavirus, because it's trivial compared to what's going to happen with climate change. That's like our nuclear disarmament folks who say, don't worry about having nowhere to live, because if the bomb falls, it'll be all over. No, that's not the way to talk to people. We have to unite, to say, fund healthcare, not warfare, and then how we're going to rebuild the economy with the Green New Deal.
Absolutely. We need an inspiring, all-encompassing vision and plan. Thank you, Jonathan. Robert Connor.
Yeah, so I'd like to point out that Seth Moulton would not say no first use. If you go on YouTube, he actually doesn't say that he will stand by no first use, which I find terrifying. The other thing about electing Democrats and getting Trump out is we have to somehow figure out how to get gerrymandering removed, because all across the country, where there's a popular vote, the Democrats elect a governor, and then they end up with about 30% of the legislature. So that's a big thing. And the last thing is there's a newsletter called POGO, Project on Government Oversight, and it's run by a lot of ex-military, and they are very, very fed up with the way the Pentagon is doing things. So it's a very worthwhile newsletter to see. That's all I want to say.
Thank you so much, Robert. And if you could put some of those links in the chat box, that would be great.
Will do.
So thank you very much. On behalf of the Massachusetts Peace and Climate Working Group, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I want to welcome you to join with us as we go forward. This is just the beginning. We've got a huge task in front of us. It's going to be fun if we do it together. If we sing and we dance and we vision, it's going to be great. It's a lot better than the nightmares that I'm having if we don't do it together. So, any last words, Rosalie, Paul, Gordon? Paul?
When's the next meeting, Paula?
The next meeting of the Peace and Climate Working Group is, Rosalie, when's the next meeting? You're muted.
I think it's Wednesday.
Wednesday at 7
Wednesday,
o'clock, right?
7 p.m. Right. If you want to join that Zoom meeting, please send a message to Rosalie Anders, and she'll put her email in the chat box.
Yeah, I will. It's RosalieHAnders@gmail.com.
And I think a lot of the people on the call the importance of keeping Markey in the Senate instead of Kennedy. And so Peace Action is organizing an effort to get enough signatures so that Markey can even be on the ballot. He still needs about 3,000 more signatures, and he's got a whole system set up to get those. So if you're interested in helping out on that, contact Cole or Brian at Peace Action.
Oh, and one detail, if I may, Rosalie's email is Rosalie period Anders. Excuse me, Rosalie period H. Rosalie, go for it. Rosalie.
Rosalie, you put it in the
Chat box.
I'm having trouble getting into the chat box, but here I go.
May I ask a question?
Yes. Rhonda.
Can you explain to me how the organization, I know this is Mass Peace Action. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Organized this? And then Peace and Climate Working Group, is that a subgroup of MPA?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Peace Action is an affiliate of a nationwide organization. Mass Peace Action is the statewide organization of a nationwide Peace Action organization.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Rosalie's email is in the chat box.
I just made a mistake. I'll do it again.
Could I just ask a question real quick?
But Cole put it in. Cole got it, and he got it right.
Okay,
I just have that it's not Hmail, it's Gmail.
I have a question about Markey. I have received in an envelope a thing where they expected me to get signatures for Markey, but I can't go out and get signatures. So what are they expecting? Just mine?
Yes.
Yes. Cole, can you explain what this is about? Cole?
Paul.
I can explain it. Markey is trying to get on the ballot. He needs 10,000 signatures. He only got 7,000 before the isolation hit. So the way he's doing it now is sending out individual nominations